Reports say the White House has been aware of the deal that the Kurdish-led coalition signed with an American oil firm last week. Syrian oil supplies are mainly located in the country's northeast, which is controlled by the Kurdish-led group called the Syrian Democratic Forces. Let's bring in our guest. Tony Gosling is an investigative journalist joining us out of Bristol. Layos Sazdi, political commentator from San Juan. Tony, welcome. What's your thoughts on this? The oil is in the north-west of the country, and that's where the United States happen to position its forces.
Well, many people in the modern world have seen what drugs like heroin and cocaine can do to individuals, really just destroy them. And I'm afraid it's the same with nations and oil, because the United States has really been absolutely destroyed by its addiction to oil and all of the things that can come from it. But here, what I think is going on in Syria is that part of the strategic attack on that country, the attempt at regime change, has been to build up a whole industry of stealing Syrian oil. Now, in the early years, it was mainly the Turks that were making money from stealing Syria's oil. Now it's other groups, like the Kurds, who are making money from stealing Syria's oil. So what they've done really is to build up whole armies of oil thieves who have now built up their own income and massive revenues that they're getting from this theft of the oil. And those people have a very, very strong incentive to keep that oil and not to let it go back to who it rightfully belongs, President Assad and the Syrians. And this obsession with oil, I think, really goes back to the 1945, the end of the Second World War, where behind Winston Churchill's back, the Americans were taking over parts of the world. I mean, obviously, they've taken over where the British Empire left off, but this was a formal thing behind Churchill's back, where Roosevelt, on the February the 14th, 1945, at the Bitter Lake on the Suez Canal, met up with Saudi Arabia's King Abdulaziz and formally signed the documents that there was going to be this very long-term umbilical agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States for massive amounts of oil in exchange for massive amounts of money. And everyone knew at that time the United States was a very, very major power at the end of the Second World War and would really be the big superpower of the post-war world. So obviously the Saudis at the time thought they were making a great deal, but actually what it's done is it's dragged the whole region down into an obsession with oil, and which we didn't really need to have. You know, for example, the motor car, which has exploded across the West in the United States and Europe, was actually replaced something which was much more efficient and much better, called the railways. But that was done deliberately to expand this massive interest in oil, and actually oil has become an addiction which is killing the host. So it's killing credibility in Turkey, the Kurds and the United States since the Second World War.
Sure. Now, Layos, there's another side to the argument that the United States is essentially, according, Damascus accusing Washington of stealing the Syrian oil. This is oil that the Syrian government can use to help its people to prosper, to help the country's infrastructure. It's it's been ravaged, the country, by war for 9 years, maybe more. Is this part of the equation? Do you think that the United States doesn't want the Syrian government to get hold of this oil so that it can help its people?
Perhaps 3 points. One, indeed, will be to deny the Syrian government of the means to try to rebuild its economy, its infrastructure. According to Reuters, Syria was producing before the beginning of the war in 2011 around 380,000 barrels of oil per day. And that compares to the Iraqi Kurdistan that we fought Kirkuk. It has been producing around 250,000 barrels of oil per day, although they claim that with new investment they have been able to increase it to 400,000 anyway. That's to deny to Syria the means to rebuild itself, to use that oil so that it doesn't have to pay for expensive oil imports, although now the price of oil is quite down. One reason. Second reason, to try to support or give the economic means for a future independent or semi-independent Syrian Kurdish region, backed by the Syrian Democratic Forces, this armed illegal group formed by Washington supposedly to fight Daesh, but probably they would like to use it against Damascus one day eventually, and something like the Kurdish regional government in Iraq that it has been using its oil revenues without, I understand, the permission of Baghdad, giving contracts to foreign oil companies that were not paying their dues to Baghdad. Third point, profit for an oil or for American oil companies. And the Iraqi government has reported that in the Kurdish regional government of the Kurdish region, there are several companies that haven't received a license by Baghdad, by the Iraqi Ministry of Oil, to exploit oil in Iraq. And those include, according to a list, I believe, provided by the Iraqi government, Aspect Energy, an American company. I'm mentioning now American companies: Chevron, Hess, Hunt Petroleum, I believe, and Murphy Oil Corporation. Now, we don't know from the reports the name of the oil company that has reached an agreement with the Syrian Democratic Forces, this illegal armed group armed by the Americans in northeastern Syria. But probably one of the companies I just mentioned may have ties, since they are so close, neighboring Iraqi Kurdistan to neighboring Syrian Kurdistan, with the unknown oil company that have signed this agreement, right, which certainly is going to gain some profits. And I believe I read that the Americans gave the Saudis supervision, oversight of Syria's oil fields under American occupation, under puppets of the Syrian Democratic Forces, to manage that. So probably the Saudis are also getting their part. So it's like the Turks that were, when Daesh occupied those oil fields, they were profiting. There were reports that claimed that one of the sons, or the son of Erdogan, President Erdogan, was illegally exporting oil extracted by Daesh, and that Japan was buying that illegally extracted oil that was profiting the family of Erdogan.
Very interesting point you raised there, Leos. Let me just address that to Tony. Tony, Leos raises a very interesting point about Kirkuk, the US-backed Kurds that took over Kirkuk, oil-rich, and essentially to destabilize or prevent Iraq from prospering. What's your views on that? That this so-called the Syrian the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, they're US-backed. They're striking a deal with the US to get the oil. I mean, America, does it need that oil, or is it more about America preventing Syria from using that oil to help the country recover?
Look, the oil is a massively valuable resource, and the Turks, including the Erdogan's son, Bilal Erdogan, who was there was an attempt to prosecute him for stealing the oil. They look across the border and they think, we want some of that. That's lots of good money for us. Now, the UN should be there to stop this sort of thing, but it isn't. It's not stopping it, and it's allowing these regime changes to happen far too often. And the only thing that's really stopped it happening in Syria is the intervention of the superpower, nuclear-armed, that's the Russians. That's the only thing that stopped it happening. So there is no real UN effective force other than Russia, I'm afraid, in the region. But look, we have to remember that the Syrian Democratic Forces are working with NATO. This is really just part of a military operation by the West. I mean, if you talk to British soldiers, they'll tell you in the pub, they'll tell you actually what we're really doing is nothing principled. It's just stealing for the tribe. And that's what they're doing. They're stealing this oil for the NATO tribe. And of course, Turkey is still a member of NATO. Now, just imagine if the Russians were to think, oh, there's lots of oil and there's some nice resources, maybe some timber in Alaska. You know what we're going to do? We're just going to seize Alaska and see how we get on. We will take all that and we'll sell it and make a lot of money. the Americans might have something to say about that, mightn't they? But that's exactly what's happening here in Syria.
Right.
This is a massive land grab and resource theft which needs to be nailed right now. And the Syrian Air Force could consider destroying some of these oil fields to deny them to an enemy that's on their territory.
OK, gentlemen, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Very interesting points raised there. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol. Laos Sazdi, as always, political commentator from San Juan. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your contribution. Dear viewers, that wraps up our news review segment for this bulletin. Stay tuned. More news is on the way.